Brnie. Pani Mazalowa ma podwójną formację, jak wielu z naszych gości, a mianowicie ukończyła filozofię oraz filologię klasyczną, jest latynistką i w dalszej swojej drodze naukowej skierowała się właśnie ku mediewistyce. Już z mediewistyki zrobiła swój doktorat, którego owocem jest ta oto książka, którą pozwolę sobie Państwu pokazać. Ponieważ w swoich indywidualnych zainteresowaniach badawczych koncentruje się wokół wczesnej czeskiej reformacji i eschatologii i właśnie wyrazem tego jest również ta publikacja. Natomiast trzeba również powiedzieć drugą bardzo ważną rzecz, a mianowicie, że pani Mazalowa stanowi część zespołu, który wydaje dzieła Jana Husa w edycjach krytycznych w ramach Continuatio Medievalis serii Hortus Deliciarum wydawanej przez znane wydawnictwo Brefols. I to jest może, to są takie najważniejsze informacje. Natomiast teraz oddam już głos naszemu gościowi i przekazuję.
Dear colleagues, first of all, including the vigor, courage, and stubbornness, as well as the rhetoric ingenuity. This applies even to the most prominent eschatological topic of his work and life, Antichrist. The term Antichrist impacts both the content and the rhetoric of Hus' reformatory critics, because Hus reveals Antichrist mainly within his fight for the reform of the Church. Hus comes to the criticism of the Antichrist in a similar way as his so-called predecessors did, Milic from Kroměříž and Matěj from Janov. He observes that the morals of representatives of the Church deteriorate rapidly. Their mission should be imitatio Christi, but they become Christ opposites. Therefore, in the otherwise plain Hus's commentary to Lombard sentences, we read: Ab hac doctrina discedentes filii ecclesiae degeneres ut ignavi trutani balbuciunt, ut rane coaxant et ut cicade cicitant velut Antichristi titinili et nuncii, etc. Please take notice of the term discedentes in red color and also degeneres, which will be used also in next sentences and works about the Antichrist. And so Antichrists are hypocrites who come from within the Church. Thus, it is not easy to identify them, and therefore they are so dangerous. Like Milic or Matěj, Hus continues Augustine's definition of Antichrist that we can find in the commentary in Epistulam Johannis ad Partos Tractatus Decem. So, you can see in the slide, Antichristi multifacti sunt, omnes heretici, omnes schismatici, ex nobis exeunt. Very important is ex ecclesia exeunt. Latine enim Antichristus contrarius est Christum. Czech authors think that society may be saved by preachers. They ought to uncover contemporary Antichrists, rebuke them publicly, and by doing that, protect people, himself, as well as other clergy from condemnation. Therefore, Hus, who perceives himself primarily as a preacher, writes at the end of 1412 from his preacher's exile in his letter to Christian. Christian was a rector of the Charles University in 1412 and 1413, and Hus writes very wittily, because name Hus means in the old Czech goose. In your language it is, I think, geisha, yeah. And in Latin, auca. So the first letter of auca is in capital. Et oportet quod auca alas moveat, contra alas vehemut. Et contra caudam, quae semper cooperit abominationem bestiae Antichristi. Vemihi ergo si super ista abominatione non predicavero, non flevero, et non scripsero. Clamat aquila volitans, ve hominibus habitantibus in terra. Milic, Matthieu, and Hus continued a strong domestic preaching tradition, and especially the idea that the preacher plays a key role in the process of human resurrection. However, the critique of the present Antichrist cannot be found in the preceding domestic tradition. Hus also often refers to the same biblical sources as his predecessors did. Hus does not precisely cite from their work, and unlike them, he does not systematically analyze the Antichrist myth, nor does he count Antichrist's arrival and the end of the world. Based on the same principles, each author creates different details. Although the Hussite movement brings about division in the church, it is important to stress that Hus loves the church, and like Matthieu from Jan, he considers schism, but not only the papal schism, but the disunity of the church, the biggest manifestation of the contemporary Antichristism. Hus criticizes only the current practice of the church and some of its representatives. Hus never fully complies with one of his muses, John Wycliffe, as he does not refuse the institution of the Pope. He agrees with Wycliffe only in regard to the criticism of the practice of the church, and he picks and chooses from the criticism carefully. Sometimes he takes large citations from Wycliffe's work. Later he even refers to him directly. In his faith, Hus remains orthodox, but his formulation and presentations are unusually provocative. This happens also thanks to Wycliffe's influence. Together with his intercessions, this development becomes fatal for Hus. This is the portrait from Deus Illustrium Majoris Britanniae, etc. Summario from the 16th century. And o Wycliffe nejenom ty hlavu zvykleš, it is one marginal note, which was written on a manuscript of John Wycliffe, manuscript, which was written by Jan Hus, so during this Hus's activities. One of the most important researchers of Hus, František Šmahel from Prague, has recently questioned the terms Hus's predecessors in his monography about Jan Hus. This term comes from the work of Augustin Zitter, Lebensbeschreibungen, etc. You have it in the slide. From the 18th century. The opponents of these terms argue that in Hus's work there are no citations of Waldhauser, Milic, or Matthieu. My view is that without Milic and Matthieu, our auka, so our goose, wouldn't fly so fiercely, or maybe wouldn't fly at all, and that this term cannot be refused. In slide, you can see some of their shared basic sources, but these are only examples. Even in case of medieval intellectual environment, one cannot base an argument on the fact that in some author's work we can or cannot find citations. It is necessary to take into account the different importance of various authorities, the variety of situations, and the weight of the oral tradition. So firstly, the weight of authority was verified by his long-term validity, and thus even Hus referred naturally to historically old names. In case of the Antichrist topic, Hus referred to, for example, Augustine or Bernard of Clairvaux, and he presented the remaining authorities anonymously or by means of paraphrases. Although the ideas of Hus's contemporaries or predecessors were also irreplaceable due to their topicality, it was unthinkable to put them on the same level as the verified official authorities. And secondly, how come John Wycliffe was cited and referred to by his name? The Prague intellectual circle was a lively society, where many similar voices were heard, not just those of Milic and Matthieu. And it wasn't necessary to apologize for the individual voices and persons. In contrast, Hus disposed of Wycliffe's complete and unique written work, unique in the terms of its line of reasoning. And what is more, this work became the reason of rift between the reformatory stream and the official church. So, to cite Wycliffe equaled the explicit fight against burning of Wycliffe's books. Now we have in the slide comparison of Wycliffe's homily, Confortamini in Domino, and Hus's synodal preaching, State Succincti. So, here we have one another view on the citations of Wycliffe, because sometimes it is Hus who adds the term Antichrist to Wycliffe's criticism, although Wycliffe doesn't deal with the Antichrist in the used book or not explicitly. For example, this homily, Confortamini in Domino, is one source of Hus's preaching, but Wycliffe uses the term Antichrist only once and not at the same place. So it is not too simple to evaluate Wycliffe's influence, because Hus in his preaching State Succincti uses the term Antichrist very often. Let's wrap up the short overview of the contemporary situation, without which Hus wouldn't have been who he was. His criticism of the church's corruption had a strong basis because the so-called predecessors had a range of supporters among preachers. Let us remind ourselves of, for example, Mateusz de Cracovia, Matthew of Krakow, John called Marienwerder of Kwidzyn, or Henricus Bitterfeld. People's interest in preaching grew. In 1391, the Bethlehem Chapel was founded, and in this chapel, preachings were conducted exclusively in Czech and on contemporary social topics. Here we have Bethlehem Chapel today in Prague, and also the interior. So, chapter 2. Hus criticism, the beginnings and the works of various functions. In his treatise, Regula Rhetoric et Novi Testamenti, Matthew from Janov referred to Milic as the second Arius. Likewise, after his death, Hus was praised by Jakobek from Stříbro. In Hus's work, we can read something more. From the very beginning, Hus considers himself as the main initiator of the Antichrist revolt. From the beginning to the end, he is strongly convinced that he can unmistakably distinguish the good from the evil, and he is such a capable preacher that he can persuade his followers. Hus is unique due to this sense. When he criticizes Antichrist, he continues his up-to-date everyday criticism of morals that we find throughout his work. This criticism is not based on the idea of Antichrist and does not use the term Antichrist or its derivations. We know it from, for example, Bohemian festive preachings, Česká kázání svátečně. When and how did the everyday criticism start to focus directly on Antichrist, and how does Hus's rhetoric change in the course of time? The exact date cannot be said because not all Hus's sermons we have. The criticism of Antichrist develops in a parallel way. It does not replace the up-to-date criticism as a whole, and rather it complements it in suitable situations. It has one rhetorical specific feature. Although its intensity and frequency grows with time, Hus does not always work exclusively with the term Antichrist and its derivations. I myself say that Hus speaks about Antichrist without Antichrist, I mean without the term Antichrist. Now let us have a look at how he speaks about the Antichrist in works of the various functions. And you have some examples also in your handouts. In the commentary, Super Canonicas from 14.4 and 14.5, we directly come across the Antichrist topic and the Antichrist terminology. In his criticism of the contemporary time, Hus is much bolder. He defines Antichrist and claims that many Antichrists are already present in the world. Moreover, he observes the relation between Antichrist's arrival and the upcoming end of the world. It is finis seculi. The contemporary disobedience of prelates, sins of all people like pride, blasphemy, disobedience, disputes, and as the most typical schism, but also there not only the papal schism, persecution and lie bring Hus to the idea of Antichrist and is a sign of the fact that it is a novissima hora, novissimum tempus or tempora novissima. Antichrist is mentioned here in the morally eschatological context. On a general level, Antichrist is represented by a contemporary multizim. The highest Antichrist is not mentioned by Hus as yet. Hus comes to the idea of Antichrist and the final days of the world from his own initiative. Thus, it is not a result of mere connection of previously given pericopes, which is the standard for the literature of the commentator. The following excerpts are proofs of this. So, first one. Hus completes the expression novissimum tempus and the description of the adult time of the pericope, the first letter of Peter, which itself does not evoke the end of times. Nunc est illud novissimum tempus. Homines voluptatum amatores magis quam Dei habentes quidem speciem pietatis. When interpreting the pericope, the second letter of Peter, we can observe another Husis initiative. Hus does not speak generally about homines, but besides the people also about the clergy. And what's more, he mentions the division of the church. Contentiones, quia nunc sunt tempora novissima, iam tam in clero, quam vulgo abicitur veritas. When interpreting the biblical text, filioli mei novissima hora est, there is no doubt that the pericope as such has an eschatological character. In spite of that, one may find a detail proving that Hus does not stick to the general commentary to the pericope. It connects its content with the present day and finds Antichrist directly in its presence. This detail is the schism. So, nunc quid novissima non est hora, domestici persecutionem faciunt in ecclesia, tatio de Antichristo, and abominandi pestem schismatis. In the university sermon to honor Charles IV, Abitiamus opera tenebrarum, that took place on the 1st of December 1404, Hus does not shy away from speaking about Antichrist at the very beginning of his sermon. Nunc heus sunt illi dies de quibus predixit apostolus, quia in novissimis diebus instabunt tempora periculosa, quia sumus in quos fine saeculorum devenerunt, quia Antichristus venit, et Antichristi multi facti sunt. In the treatise De Sanguine Christi Glorificato, which he wrote in the second half of 1405, for the first time in his work he reacts to one very concrete event, the Wilsnack miracles. In Brandenburg's Wilsnack, 3 wafers were found, and they were apparently colored by Christ's blood. The little town then became a place of pilgrimage where miracles were supposed to take place. However, it was a fraud, whose aim was gain financial profit. The possibility of such apparition of Christ's blood was opposed by many theologians and also by Prague masters, including Hus and Stanislav from Znojmo. Based on their initiative, the Archbishop forbade pilgrimage to Wilsnack in 1405. Let us notice that for the time being Hus is in compliance with both the Archbishop as well as Stanislav and the false Christians and prophets, as it was predicted that this will take place during the final days, are called the fraudsters of Wilsnack. Hus supports his statements on the final time by means of the Gospel according to Matthew. You can see these passages in the slide. So, multi pseudo prophete, surgent, et seduce et multos, ipsorum verbis et miraculis confidendo, decipiendo, surgent enim pseudo Christi et pseudo prophete, dabunt signa magna et prodigia, eta ut in errorem inducantur, si fieri potes etiam electi. And very similar passages at the end of the slide. These three works prove that Hus speaks about Antichrist in words of different functions. However, the fight against Antichrist is primarily a part of the reformatory struggle, and therefore there are more works that are aimed at clergy and students. Chapter 3. From the very beginning, Hus had in his mind concrete antichrists. But he was an excellent speaker and strategist, so their identities were revealed slowly and ingeniously. In that respect, the criticism of Antichrist changes, depending on the addressee and the concrete situation. The comparison with two of Hus's synodal sermons may help us cast light on his method. On the 19th of September 1405, Hus gave his first synodal sermon, De Leges Dominum Deum. The sermon took place on the St. Lucas Synod and was requested by the Archbishop. At that time, Hus was also supported by King Václav IV, and so far Hus did not feel any direct attack on himself. Hus sees Antichrist mainly in the charge disunity, and in the resistance against the Reformation efforts. However, he does not point his finger at concrete individuals as yet. Apart from the most prominent issue, the schism, Hus criticized fornication, simony, and the incorrect Eucharistic service. He uses the term Antichrist or its derivations more sparsely before the synod than in other situations. He is, however, a good speaker and is able to criticize Antichrist and provoke the clergy even without the frequent using of this terminology. So, now let's have a look at the structure of his criticism of Antichrist in De Leges. The term Antichrist has an exact place here. In the introduction, where Hus lectures the listeners that Antichrist is already present in the charge, and in the criticism almost at the end of the sermon. Moreover, let us notice that in the introductory excerpts, the term Antichrist co-occurs a long expression of deterioration or decline in red color. So, Ecclesia Pragensis et Ecclesia Romana inventis degenerat, et per consequens sunt Ecclesiae Antichristi. Or, si tertia pars Ecclesiae des clerus autem apostata nulla est peor vel austerior nimirum Antichristus, quia ubi est gradus vel status altior, est casus gravior. Declinando a prima editate et sic ab imitatione Christi ad saeculum sum pessimi tempore Antichristi. This idea that the higher the position within the church hierarchy, the worse Antichrist there is, has been taken from Wycliffe's work, in this particular case from the Sermones. Christiani debet imitare Christum Dominum, quia aliter in moribus forent degeneres, non filii Christi, sed filii Antichristi. Additionally, he uses the term Minister Antichristi to refer to a priest who does not perform sacraments in a good way. Almost in the end, Hus criticized twice the so-called Antichrist notes, Antichristi glossulae, by which he means the notes of the persons guilty of simony. Apart from the connection Antichristi glossulae, which I didn't manage to find in the work of Milic, Maciej Fromianov, or in the selected works of Wycliffe, we may conclude that it is the traditional Antichrist terminology as was documented by Alexander Paczewski, for example, in case of the given expressions in the Wycliffe's work. And now Antichrist without Antichrist. In the main part of the sermon, De Leges Dominum Deum, the criticism of Antichrist graduates, although Hus does not use the word Antichrist at all. It is possible due to the several reasons. The criticism closely elaborates on the above-mentioned introduction. This connection is strengthened mainly by expressions denoting deterioration or decline, degenerare, declinare, etc. But most importantly, it is possible because of the fact that Hus exploits the biblical and non-biblical authorities who announce Antichrist's arrival and trace even without using the expression Antichrist. It is the Gospel of Matthew 24, Bernard of Clairvaux, or Lamentations, for example. Also, in his other works, who speaks about Antichrist without Antichrist because, number one, he has a very close proximity to the biblical language, and number two, because no clergyman may accuse us of explicitly referring to somebody as the Antichrist. Let us examine the procedure Hus uses. He always prefers to biblical proof, therefore even in delegates the first place belongs to the Gospel of Matthew 24. Nunc abundalit iniquitas, refriguit caritas in the nobis. Hus appeals to the clergy to consider whether or not they might be antichrists. Let us remind ourselves of one of the initial statements on the apostasy, which is the Antichrist marker. See autem apostatat. Yes, this connection with apostata. And let us again remind ourselves of the follow-up to Augustine, who also called for consideration of one's actions. Et interrogare debet unus quisque conscientiam suam ansit Antichristus. Furthermore, the part from the Gospel of Matthew is analyzed in a very meticulous manner, and in this context, frequently used citation from the letter to Philippians is added. You have these citations in your handouts. I only made some very common structure of this. So, refriguit namque ecclesia, amor Dei tepescere, refriguit tota nostra solicitudo et intentio mundis tercoribus sic immersa. Omnes que sua sunt querunt et non que Iesu Christi. Bernard's statements are also of high importance. He was one of favorite thinkers of, for example, Wycliffe, Milich, Waldhauser, Matthew of Krakow, Tomáš Titný, Nicholas of Dresden, Jakubek from Stříbro, or the Valdesians. Qui monachi demoniaci, qui conversi perversi, qui presbyteri saduci et clerici, facti sunt heretici. Let's study also another Hus's favorite element, antithesis. Likewise, words uttered by Prophet Jeremiah, who predicted the disintegration of the church, are fulfilled. Those documents is immediately after the citation by Bernard. So, unde per hoc impletur lamentur hieremiae, etc. After these authorities, other significant passages that point to the most prominent manifestation of the contemporary Antichrist, simony, schism, and the Eucharistic service provided by unfit priests. No? It is without music, so... Thank you. Thank you very much. This is the Missal of Benedictine Marian Schaller. It is a liturgic book with the Latin text and also the Czech translation, first printed in 1925, and you know Mozart's Dies Irae. And why? In relation to the Middle Ages, one often speaks about the so-called crisis factors, especially in connection with the plague epidemics. There were epicenters of plague in Bohemia in the 14th century in the course of Hus's life in years 1418, 1994, 95, 14, 13, and 15. But Hus did not comment on the plague. For him, the only crisis factor was the disunity of the Church. Bernard's letters, epistolae, are Hus's biggest mainstays in his opinion that pastors, priests, doctors, and masters are causing the schism by their greed. Hus is fully focused on the crisis caused by people. By no means does he perceive his present days as dies irae Dei. Here we have another example. Qualiter autem insolentia clericorum turbat ecclesiam et turbavit. So people are at the beginning of these bad days. In the end, the preaching graduates and concludes with very pessimistic notes. This is quite unusual and indicative of Hus's outrage because most of Hus's sermons include an optimistic conclusion. Peccatum cleri profunde et late indelebiliter esse scriptum, quis enim potest cordatam late cauterizata sanare. Nobis est impossibile, cum clerus sit cor populi, quod non licet ut inquiut antingere. Cum remurmuras clerus dicit, non licet cleri presentis coram populo sanim criminis extergere et vulneratum cor verbo Dei tangere, et sic caritativam infundere medicinam. Unde coram populosa clerus impurice crimine vulnerat, vulnus porta publice, sed medicinam purgativam criminis respulit quasi freneticus et vesanus. Shift in state succincti. This is the second synodal preaching or sermon took place on the 18th of October 1407 on the topic State Succincti, on the letter to Ephesians, and therefore schism remained the most prominent sign. The criticism, however, grew stronger because since 1405 several serious events had occurred. Since 1406, persecution of the reform movement started in connection with the questions of wickedism and remanence. In 1407, simony committed by clergy is being intensely discussed. Hus is more open in front of the synod, and he begins to repeat Wycliffe's idea that in search for Antichrist we must look quite high in the hierarchy of the Church. Besides authorities who use Antichrist terminology, for example, the first letter by John to 18. Generally, the frequency of the word Antichrist is growing. Hus even complements the statements by Gregory the Great in Registrum Epistolarum by the term Antichristus, which we can see in his work for the first time. Although in concrete criticism he refrains from using this term, he uses it at least twice in the end, and the non-biblical authorities are presented at the very beginning of the sermon. The number of other related words grows astronomically. These denote the evil or immorality, and Hus uses them as synonyms for Antichrist. The problem of schism is being elaborated on by Hus. He also explains the expression Antichrist in great detail. This cannot be considered as commonplace. Unlike in case of Diliges, there are more than just isolated and fragmentary statements in this aspect. The statements are precise and placed purposely in such a way so that they form a short but a complete explication. Moreover, this one is composed of a clear question and answer, so we can read. Sed qui sub hi revera praecipue illi, qui sub nomine Christi moribus Christi sunt contrarii et qui quod Christus colligit, ipsi dispergunt, etc. Hoc enim et vis vocis inuit Hus nominis, Antichristus. Dicitur enim Antichristus quasi adversans Christo vel contrarius Christo, sed in quo in non si non in moribus et operibus malignis, quibus homo transformator in diabolum et induit Antichristum. It isn't typical for sermons. In Starter, Hus elaborates on the antithesis much more. Parallelism is more distinct here because Hus does not focus on the criticism of the negative side only, but he likes developing interpretations about Christ and true Christians too. What's more, this positive aspect usually occupies the first place within his explications. So, sicut enim clerici dicuntur principaliter Christi, etc., sic principaliter armis virtutum debunt indui, et Christum Dominum immeditatius imitari. And antithesis, cum alias in vanum nomen Dei sui Christi assumerent, et nec Christi nec Christiani dicerentur veraciter, sed forent verius pessimi Antichristi. And some antitheses are very long. You have this citation in your handouts, so it isn't necessary to read it everything. But for example, et qui fidelis inventus fuerit vere erit angelus Domini, sacerdos Dei altissimi, presum magnus pontifex eximius, coheres Christi, vicarius Christi. Nam quicum primo refuga in veritate non steterit, et lumbos precinctus non fuerit, et pedes justitiam non calceatus, etc. And now, the synonyms. Erit, Judas Iscariot, Diabolus, Belial, Satan, Behemoth, Leviathan, Mammon, Bel, Asmodeus, Sacerdos Dagon, Balaam, Coheres Antichristi, Gubernator Lucifer, Princeps Tenebrarum, Nuncius Malii, Tuba Mendaci, Amicus Luciferi, Cleri Confusio, Vicarius Antichristi, etc. So this is Hus's style in Starter Succinctum. Chapter 4. Works aimed at populum and the personal experience. Development occurs also within works aimed at populum. However, this is mainly connected with the development of the term Antichrist, which is the result of large changes within the church as well as Hus's personal situation. As a representative of ad populum, I have chosen Hus's Czech postil from 1413, and it partly includes Hus's letters. Here we find criticism of Antichrist during 1408-1415. Both pieces of work mediate the link to the contemporary situation. Thus, the correspondence is a unique material because Hus's inner experience concerning the key events of his life, his exile, the constant trial, and waiting for execution. In contrast to the Czech festive preachings, both pieces of work are full of criticism of Antichrist, and the term Antichrist is often explicitly used there. Nevertheless, this term does not occur in all instances of the Antichrist criticism, and Hus maintains the style that we demonstrated on his sermon Diligence. Nevertheless, we observe an increase in the Antichrist terminology, especially in tense situations. In comparison to the synodal sermons, Hus speaks more concretely about Antichristism and almost doesn't criticize sins on a general level. Biblical sources remain similar. He still refers even to Bernard of Clairvaux. In the letters as well as the postil, the criticism of Antichrist is most prominently reflected in the reaction to the ban and burning of some of Wycliffe's books and the ban of free speech, and this continues until his death in 1415, who starts having serious problems with the Archbishop in 1408. At the time, the Archbishop's being banned preachings against the clergy, as well as pointing to clergy's flaws. He also ordered the burning of all Wycliffe's books, besides the interest in the post-schism grows in the society. In 1410, the Synod decides that selected Wycliffe's books must be burned, and preachings on private venues apart from 4 selected types of churches are prohibited under the threat of anathema. According to Hus, the ban on preaching was against all principles of Christianity that are based on free preaching of gospel. This is the point when Hus's own personal and unfortunately fatal fight against Antichrist starts. At this moment, the highest Antichrist is the Archbishop Zbigniew, who was the initiator of the above-mentioned bans. Other Antichrists are Hus's opponents and prosecutors. The turning point is obvious from the fact that since Zbigniew's decisions, Hus starts appealing solely to God and the Pope in 1410. Appello primo ad Deum, demum ad sedem apostolicum. So it is important, the citation in red color, ad sedem apostolicam. But he adds, nunquid in Christi nomine et virtute sancta obedientiae debet predicatio prohiberii. Revera potius deberent dicere Antichristi nomine invocato, in virtute maledictae obedientiae mandamus, ne verbum Dei in capellis predicatum. Zbigniew confirms his Antichrist role when he really has the books burned, and when on the 18th of July 1410 he pronounces anathema upon Hus and those who have joined him. What's more, in 1411, through Michael de Caussis, the Archbishop dares to accuse Hus of heresy for the first time. Other signs of the Antichrist time period were the increasing disputes between the Archbishop and Václav IV, as well as the unrest among the general public. To add to that, in 1412, the theological faculty officially splits from Hus in regard to the question of Antichrist, as the faculty refused the premise that Antichrist is already present in the world. This stance was joined also by the king, and so Hus and his Reformation party remained alone with their views on Antichristism. In October 1412, the resolution to harden the anathema upon Hus was declared by the Cardinal Stefaneschi. In this insoluble situation, Hus appeals against it again. However, this time he appeals only to Christ himself, and he chooses to leave Prague for Krakovec because, according to him, as a free and alive man, he is more useful in the fight against Antichrist. Here we have the second Pope, Antichrist. It isn't a picture of Jan Hus or picture from his own work, but this Pope, it has Satan, gives the indulgence, and it is from so-called časové obrazy. I can translate into English like temporal pictures from the turn of the 15th century. Author is probably Martin Lukács, and it is from the Jena Codex. I think here this codex. So, item isto si papa es predestinatus et exercet officium pastorale sequens Christum in moribus, etc. Si vero vivit Christo contrarie. Lupus rapax hypocrita et nunc inter omnes viantes praecipus Antichristus. This was a citation from Hus's treatise De Tribus Dubiis from 1412, Hus writes that theoretically Antichrist may be a sinner, including a sinful pope. However, he does not in fact theorize. Rather, he criticized, for example, the manner of granting indulgences by John 23rd. In the letters as well as the postil, Hus often uses the antithesis of the Christ and the Pope, the Antichrist, when criticizing the Pope. In the postil, we may find, for example, a distinct antithesis which comes from Zachary 9:9 and Pseudo Chrysostomus and shows the contours of the humble Christ on a donkey and the pompous Pope on a white horse. This antithesis cannot be found in Hus's predecessors, Wycliffe or elsewhere in Hus's work. It is very similar to the famous antithesis in the work by Nicholas of Dresden, Tabula Veteris et Novi Coloris, Cortina de Antichristo, and its Czech pictorial treatment in the Jena Codex. It is originally in Czech, so you have it in English. I don't know how the Pope could read well if he was able to, or the bishop, or many of the former popes, archbishops, cardinals, canons, and priests, etc. The Christ on donkey, and him, it is Pope, on a big white horse with a golden bridle. And this is, or these are pictures from mentioned Jena Codex. This codex includes many works connected with Hussite movement, and it is from the 15th or 16th century. Moreover, in other places in the Apostle Hus explicitly concedes to fight against the Pope. This fact, the criticism of the Pope's concrete sins and the sins of the clergy represent the most significant shift in terms of the content of the Antichrist term. Okay. In spite of that, Hus' faith in victory over Antichrist remains strong, and Hus feels to be the leading fighter in this battle. Originally, it is also in Czech, so you have the English translation. First, they prepared nets of persecution and interdict for Hus, it means the goose, and now for others too. But because the goose is a lazy, homely bird that does not fly high, it started tearing the nets, and with it other birds which fly high to get through their ways of life tore the nets. They persecuted, intimidated by the interdict as the pointed wooden pole, and shot the last arrow from the Antichrist quiver when they stopped service to God and his commendation. In spite of the many letters in which Hus asked for support and consoles himself, he remains strong in his decision to become a martyr, if necessary. Sed spero cum Dei gratia quoci oportueri, volame adversus eos usque ad ignem comburendum statuere, melius est bene mori quam male vivere. It is from his exile in Kozi, from July. The Council of Constance. Hus considered the Council of Constance another of God's tests. He left almost without worries because he was given a promise of Sigmund's safe conduct. With time, the safety measure first changed to doubt, and then to the feeling of certainty that Hus's days are numbered. Awaiting his execution in June 1415, Hus recapitulates his efforts and says goodbye. Even then, at such a serious moment, Hus criticizes schism and takes on the role of the Christ fighter in red color. Schismata extirpatis. The articles based on which Hus was sentenced included many accusations of his preaching, Wycliffe's heresy, and also of disrespecting the Pope. The accusations were also based on both the alleged as well as the real statements Hus had made in regard to Antichrist. However, even those were taken out of context, as we can see in Hus's last reaction to the articles in the responsum ultimum, or so-called responsiones breves. Hus did not use the last opportunity to recant and did not change his stance. On the 6th of July, he was stripped of his priesthood and burned. Taken out of the medieval context, we may conclude that Hus's fight against Antichrist was in fact a fight for freedom of speech, gathering and studying without censorship. In this way, I would like to end my presentation on a lighter note. It was not a coincidence that in 1968, the singer Hanna Hegerova realized her song about Jan Hus, named Preaching in the Bethlehem Chapel, Kázání v Betlémské kapli. Given the political context of the time period, The song was not about us only. So, thank you. The text you have in your hands. Thank you very much. And I'm so sorry that it wasn't Karol Gosz.
Dear Lucie, thank you, thanks a lot for such a complex and in the same way very detailed presentation. It was a great pleasure, and I think I didn't know about many details of the history of Jan Hus and of course of his Antichrist, also of his Antichrist preaching and everything he said about it.
Yeah, these are only examples. There are so many citations, especially in letters, and I think if there is something very good for not beginners, but from somebody who doesn't know Jan Hus, it is very good to take correspondence. It is very open, very clear. It is very intimate, and in this correspondence it is true about Jan Hus, not in some official process and in some official works, but mainly in this correspondence. This is my tag for you.
Thank you.
No, I thank you for your for everything, and especially to Anya.
Thank you. But to our audience, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Michael.
So thank you for your lecture. It was really fascinating for me. I have to add, we've already talked once about Hus' biography. And this lecture confirmed the theories which I suddenly, thanks to you, discovered about Hus, that he, with passage of time, becomes more and more radical in the sense that at the beginning he was looking for a conversation, he was looking for a compromise, he wanted simply to be listened in Rome and by church authority. And with passage of time, he discovered there is no platform of discussion, there is no dialogue possible. And going back to the main topic of today, what is striking for me, that I don't know if I'm right, please correct me if I'm not right, this way from rather more abstract concept of Antichrist towards more personalized image of Antichrist. I mean this quotation very important for me from Matthew 24, where and also repeated then from Bernardus de Clairvaux. Nunc abundavit iniquitas, quia refliguit caritas in nobis.
It's very often.
It's very often, but where the emphasis is put, in fact, is put on abstract, no, iniquitas. So I interpreted this quotation in this way, that it is an attempt from the part of Hus, at the beginning at least, to explain the phenomenon of Antichrist in terms of struggle between bad and good in general. Whereas iniquitas, this iniquitas at the beginning has no concrete name. Is it so or not? I'm right or not?
Not because it is only some picture of his works, but in his mind he knows concrete Antichrist. He only didn't speak about the concrete names, about concrete persons, but he knows that this priest is bad and he is Antichrist. But it was not so important for the whole church. So it wasn't important to give the name into some preaching or into some text. But he knows who Antichrist was. When, I don't know, in 14 or 1408, Antichrist was the Archbishop Zbigniew. So it is person much more important for the whole church. So it is necessary to put it in some text, in some, but I think the Antichrist was never something abstract. It is only rhetoric in his sermons and in his works, but not in his mind. The idea was concrete from the beginning.
No reflection about the good and bad and good and something like that. No.
It is. Yes, it is much more concrete during the time. You are right, but I think it is connected not with some abstraction, but of the concrete persons who are much more important than one priest somewhere in some village, and because in the church hierarchy, it is necessary to find somebody who is higher and higher, and when it could be Archbishop, it could be also the Pope, and when it is Pope, it is no possibility to make some compromise with the church. So since 1412, there is no compromise. Hus is very, I don't know how to say it. He knows his own right and true, and there isn't possible to make some compromise with somebody who is, for example, that pope or that archbishop. It isn't possible, and this is reason of his end, because he wanted to discuss with somebody. He didn't want. Yeah.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Reading all those examples, I had an impression that between the rhetorical means he used, there were no so numerous means as argumentum ad personam.
Mm-hmm.
So if he had someone concrete in mind, you would expect that he would use more those epithets, deteriorating persons he had in mind.
Mm-hmm.
And here I had an impression that that he used more things like this Antichrist, or maybe defining the persons by their vices, and not this very concrete way of
you think it is quite common, this rhetoric, or?
I think maybe it's a bit unusual if he had on mind very concrete persons, and what's more, it's unobservable this way of argumentation, even if this
it's our official argumentations, and we don't know. We know that, for example, the Leges Dominum Deum is or was rewritten by Hus himself, but it wasn't typical. We have some text made by his pupils, his listeners. We don't know if the preaching was this one or if there were some notes. So I think there could be these parts of his preaching, especially, but we don't have them maybe only in this text. I don't know, I think also in correspondence it is quite good in his rhetoric. He isn't bad, he isn't cruel, he is very good rhetorian, but he doesn't use some bad words or something extraordinary. No, it is this style, and he studied at university. He was very official person, so I think it is connected with his style. Yeah, professor, dean, rector. It was his style, and also during the process, I think he hoped that the end would be another. So
he didn't like to offend nobody in a personal way.
Yeah, and he was afraid about his colleagues. So it was necessary to be official because of his colleagues, because they could be next persecuted persons. So I think this is the reason of the fact about you are speaking.
Thank you. Do you have any questions? So, if not, let's thank once more our speaker. A ja pozwolę sobie jeszcze skorzystać z okazji, żeby zaprosić Państwa od jesieni na kolejne spotkania z naszego cyklu, ponieważ udało się przedłużyć finansowanie dla naszego cyklu i jeszcze do końca roku będziemy mogli zapraszać różnych gości z innych ośrodków, żeby przekazali nam właśnie różnego rodzaju ciekawe i nieznane nam wiadomości. Dziękuję bardzo.